You wake up in the middle of the night, and the first thing you notice is how quiet it is and how dark it is. And then you realize your power is out. And then you realize your freeze dryer isn't running. So what do? You grab a flashlight and you make your way to your freeze dryer. And sure enough, it is dead, cold silence. So what do you do when you have food in your freeze dryer and it's not running? We're going to go through a few steps of what you can do to make sure you can salvage your food and it doesn't spoil, and most of all, it doesn't go bad with bacteria. Step number one is you want to turn off your vacuum pump. The last thing you want is your vacuum pump going on and sucking up water. That could really damage it. Step number two is you want to release the vacuum pressure inside your vacuum pump. And the reason why is this. Most likely, the food, the shelf, and the trays are going to be hot. The majority of the time of a freeze dryer is in the drying mode, when your shelves can get up to anywhere from 120, 140, 145, depending on what they're programmed to. So this area right here is going to be hot. Meanwhile, your ice ring is going to be extremely cold. The problem is the cold of the ice ring can't get to the hot of your food to cool it down, to keep it from spoiling, when there's a vacuum inside your chamber. A vacuum can have an R value of anywhere from an R40 to an R60, even up to an R80. So you got to get rid of the vacuum so that the cold ice can transfer its temperature to your trays. And once your valve is open, leave it open. The reason you want to keep your drain valve open is as all this ice starts to melt, there's enough ice on your ice ring that once melted, it can actually submerge your bottom tray, ruining your food. If your drain valve is open, all the water will just go down into your drain bucket. A second reason to leave your drain valve open, and especially to have your pump turned off, if your power is restored and you don't have your pump turned off and your valve open and you have water inside your chamber, then you run the risk of sucking up liquid water in from your chamber into your vacuum pump, and that could destroy your vacuum pump. Any water inside your chamber, when your vacuum pump turns on, will immediately boil your water at room temperature, and the boiling of the water can splatter and pretty much ruin all the food in your trays. So no water, no vacuum. Now this is when the guessing game begins. What is the temperature of your food inside your freeze dryer? Now most likely, if you have an ice ring that's still quite apparent, there's a good chance your food is going to be below. But as the ice ring melts, you need to be able to keep track of the food and the temperature. So the time is going to come when you're going to have to open up the freeze dryer to place a thermometer inside. And the thermometer I would recommend is this good old style of thermometer. It's like a meat thermometer that you can push into your meat, and it has a scale of 0 up to 220 degrees. If you don't have one of these, I suggest you get one, and they're really inexpensive. So what we're going to do, we're going to open up the door, and we're going to put this thermometer on the second shelf down, preferably under the food. We know that the bottom shelf is the coldest shelf, and the top two are the warmest. And the second shelf is usually warmer than the top, and we want to keep track of the warmest tray because everything else is going to be cooler than the second tray. Now, opening up the door is going to let just a little bit of cold air out, but don't worry about that. It will take probably 5 to 10 minutes for your thermostat to be able to equalize and read the actual temperature inside your freeze dryer. In a power outage, there are two numbers you got to remember. One is 40, the other one is 2. Now, those are two magic numbers that are very important when it comes to food spoilage. To keep your food from spoiling, it needs to be under 40 degrees. Once it's above 40 degrees, it can stay at room temperature for 2 hours before bacteria can start growing on the food and spoiling your food. The great thing about the Harvest Right freeze dryer is there's a lot of mass here and a lot of insulation. So you have a big heavy ice ring going all the way across, and then you have a heavy stainless steel chamber that's also very, very cold, and then you have a lot of insulation on the sides and the back. The only place where you really don't have insulation is this door. And by the way, still have this thing, go ahead and toss it. This pad is only an R.76. It's less than an R1 in insulation value, and really has no value whatsoever when it comes to insulation, and it blocks such a really nice view of your food being freeze dried. So remove your pad and don't even use it. Let your dog play with it. So far, my thermostat is registering 20 degrees, which is a great temperature to be in. And so at 20 degrees, with all this cold, with all this mass, with all the ice, my food is going to stay safe for several hours. Now, at this point, you can just go back to bed or stay up or whatever you want to do. But this freeze dryer is going to stay cold for several hours. As long as you have ice and you have this ice ring, you can pretty much rest assured that your food is going to be under 40 degrees. So now here's the big question. What happens when the ice melts and you no longer have an ice ring, or you wake up or you come home to a freeze dryer that was running and you find out that your ice ring is gone? If you have a power outage and you have no ice ring, either two things have happened. The power's been off for an awful long time, or the freeze dryer has just barely started and hasn't built up an ice ring. In either case, you're going to know if your freeze dryer just barely started. But if your freeze dryer was in the middle of the cycle and the power went out and what ice ring you had melted, well, for one thing you're going to have a great amount of water down here. And if your ice ring is melted, your bottom shelf is probably going to be submerged. So in the event that you have no ice in your freeze dryer, this is what I recommend. If you find your ice ring is melted and no longer present, most likely the bottom of your freeze dryer is going to be filled with water, and perhaps the bottom tray is going to be submerged. So go ahead and open up the valve in the back and drain the water out of your freeze dryer. Now you have to make a decision. How valuable is the food that's in your freeze dryer? Well, right now it's harvest time and I have a whole lot of squash in here. If I were to lose that squash, it would not be the end of days. I got lots of squash coming on and it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. But what if you have a whole lot of meat on your trays, or a whole bunch of Panda Express food or leftovers that cost a sizable bit of money to put up? Well, you have two choices. One choice is remove your trays and feel what the temperature is of your food. So take your trays out and feel the temperature. Now, if you still find pieces of food that have a little bit of ice crystals in them and they're still hard, well, there's a good chance that that food is still going to be below 40 degrees and could still be safe. But if you feel your food and your trays are at room temperature, well, that's when you're going to have to make a decision concerning your health. Do you want to risk continuing with this food or do you want to toss your food? Now, you can either take this food, I have a gas stove, I could light it manually, and I could throw this food in a fry pan with a little bit of butter and saute this food and go ahead and eat it. Or as long as you can get this food back up to temperature, say 160, 180 degrees, well, that will kill all the bacteria. The other choice you have is taking this food and put it into a bag and take it to your freezer. Now, if you're out of power, do you want to run the risk of opening this freezer door and letting a lot of warm air in and the cold air out? So by doing that, you could end up losing some of your cold capacity in your freezer for your food. If your food is valuable enough, you can put it in your freezer, and the mass and the energy in your freezer can perhaps save your food. That's a choice you'll have to make. If you decide to reheat your food, you get a bit of a do-over. By bringing your food back up to cooking temperature, you can kill any possible bacteria. But some bacteria will generate chemicals where you can kill the bacteria, but you can't kill the chemicals. The chemicals will remain there. But bringing your food back up to temperature and cooking it, once it reaches room temperature, then you have another 2 hours at room temperature before you have to make a decision with what you're going to do with your food. But the majority of the cases, if you are in a power outage, if you leave your food in the freeze dryer, there's a good chance it's going to remain safe. The ice ring will last there for several hours, and even after that, the temperature can remain below 40 thereafter. Just make sure you have a way to track your temperature and monitor it. And remember that as long as there's liquids in your chamber, you do not want your vacuum pump to turn on, because any liquids will immediately boil, and that could damage your vacuum pump. Once power is restored, you also have a decision to make, and that is what to do with your food in your freeze dryer. Most likely your food is going to be soft and perhaps moist again, and there's going to be a lot of water and ice that's not in a frozen state. If that's the case, go ahead and start from the beginning and start a new batch with your food. Once power is restored, you have just a few moments to make up your mind on what you want your freeze dryer to do, because your freeze dryers will want to pick up where it left off. And so you have 30 seconds to make a decision. If you're not here to make that decision, the decision is going to be made for you. And that's why it's important to turn off your vacuum pump just in case, and also to open up your drain valve. As you can see, with my compressor off, the pump did not start, but the chiller did. If you have water down inside your chamber, that water could go down into your drain valve, and if the drain valve is not open, that water is going to back up against the drain valve and freeze. And if your pump is left on and starts drawing down the vacuum, and you have a frozen water in your drain valve, you will not be able to release the vacuum to open your door. Harvest Right has replaced several doors because people use crowbars and screwdrivers to pry the door open because they had no way to vent the vacuum. And let me tell you, that vacuum will remain for hours upon hours. If you did suffer a power outage, it will tell you down here how long that outage was. In this case, it's only 39 minutes. As long as you do not see any water down in this bottom part, there's a good chance that you can just pick up where you left off, and you can go ahead and continue your cycle where it is. But if you do have standing water down here, and when you open your drain valve, water drains out, I'd suggest you start over again. By canceling your program and defrosting the method which you prefer, either by fan or by the defrost mode. So take your food out of your freeze dryer and put it back in your refrigerator or freezer while you defrost the chamber. Once the chamber is defrosted, you can go ahead and start a new cycle. I hope you found these tips helpful. Most important, you want to make sure you don't damage your freeze dryer from a recovering power outage, because there's lots of liquid down here in the chamber that could get sucked in to the vacuum pump. Moreover, you don't want to end up destroying or wasting your food, especially if your food costs lots of money. Anyway, I hope this has been helpful. If you have any comments, please put them down in the comment section and I'll try to answer them. And thank you for your time. Please subscribe, and as always, go forth and freeze dry the world.